When we hear about the Great Flood, we often picture it as an outpouring of wrath from heaven, a heavy-handed punishment for humanity's sins. But have you ever asked yourself, what exactly were those sins? Was it murder, adultery, betrayal of God? If it were only those things, then why was it necessary to wipe out all of humanity, both the elderly and the innocent children, the wicked and those who hadn't yet had the chance to choose? What kind of sin would compel God not just to judge individuals, but to reset the entire order of existence? The truth may run deeper. Perhaps sin isn't only about moral actions, it might be a complete dissonance, a system gone awry from time itself to bloodlines to the very nature of the soul. The watchers, angels sent down to observe, chose instead to bear children with earthly women. They produced the Nephilim, hybrid beings between heaven and earth, possessing supernatural strength, but also seeding chaos. The Nephilim did not only dominate physically, they disrupted the sacred lineage. But don't stop there. The Nephilim weren't the cause, they were the result of a chain of distortions that began with one very small yet incredibly significant detail: the calendar. Imagine a symphony being played by an orchestra. If even one instrument goes off beat, the entire piece loses harmony. Sacred time in Scripture is not merely dates, it is a divine structure, where every ritual, covenant and promise must unfold at the appointed time. And according to the Book of Jubilees, mankind lost the sacred 364-day calendar and fell into the offbeat cycles of the nations, 360 or 365 days. As a result, sacrifices were made at the wrong time, festivals were held in the wrong season, blood and prayers were no longer offered in due time, and the divine order began to unravel, starting from things no one even noticed. It is in this very gap that the Book of Jubilees speaks. A text removed from the Bible, yet bearing an untold explanation, that the Great Flood was not merely punishment, but a rescue mission for the sacred cycle, a deliberate restart. And if that's true, then the real question is no longer who was at fault, but rather who is still keeping time correctly, who is living in the true time of the covenant, and who, right in this very century, is redefining the lineage of humanity. There was once a book passed down amidst thunder and clouds atop Mount Sinai, a book that does not speak of serpents, nor of hell, nor does it promise miracles. It tells one thing only: how to stay in sync with God, not through emotion, not through power, but through time. That book is called Jubilees. It doesn't burst forth with fiery revelations like the Book of Enoch. It doesn't overflow with dramatic images of fallen angels or giant Nephilim, and that's exactly why it was overlooked. The Book of Jubilees is the softest whisper, but it holds the most sacred structure. It defines time. When Moses went up Mount Sinai, he did not only receive the 10 Commandments. He was told the entire history from creation, but through a different lens. Every event, every promise, every trial was placed precisely within a 364-day cycle, aligned with 7-year patterns, 49-year jubilees, and the sacred rhythms God had established even before the nation of Israel existed. This sacred calendar is not just a way to count days, it is the heartbeat of the covenant between heaven and earth. If that rhythm is broken, then even the promises fall into a void. So why was the book removed? Why does it not appear in the common versions of the Bible, from Judaism to Catholicism to Protestantism? The reason is because it is too quiet. It doesn't serve power. It's not easy to use as a religious symbol. It cannot be explained in a few simple lines. And that is what makes it sacred. It doesn't paint memorable pictures. It preserves rhythms that must not be forgotten. A part of the story was cut out. We learn about creation, but not about sacred rhythm. We know of the flood, but not why humanity's timing had to be reset. And in the absence of Jubilees, we might still be living off-beat, even while reading scripture. In the wind atop Sinai, a whisper once echoed, "Write down all things according to the year, the month, and the day." But that voice is no longer heard in churches. It now only echoes for those still enough to listen, and perhaps you are one of them. The Book of Jubilees was once read, copied, revered, not at the fringes of cultural memory, but at the heart of communities who first preserved the scriptures. It was part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, among sacred scrolls guarded by the Essenes as living heritage. It was fully preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, where Christianity took root in the 4th century, yet bore the soul of a faith even older than Rome. So what happened? Who hid it? And why? The answer lies not only in time, but in power. The Book of Jubilees was not easily accepted by the councils of the Western Church because it threatened to shake a foundation that post-New Testament theology was laboring to establish, the idea that the new law replaces the old. But the Book of Jubilees does not describe a replacement. It affirms a continuation, that laws, Sabbaths, and sacrifices existed before Sinai. That Adam, Seth, Noah, Abraham all lived within a covenant shaped since the beginning of creation. This challenged the view that grace begins with Jesus as the full theological narrative. No one wants to confront the truth that what is sacred may have existed without religious institutions. If there was a law given before the Jewish people, before the law of Moses, then the central role of one nation, one temple, one priesthood becomes secondary. And if there exists a sacred cycle, independent of human calendars, then the authority to declare holy days no longer rests in the hands of the Church. That is inconvenient, and inconvenient things are often pushed aside. This is not about rejecting an idea. This is about amputating a part of memory. A sacred memory pushed into shadow, not because it is wrong, but because it does not serve the system that was growing. When evangelization became a strategy for expansion, when the law was framed as a burden, then the Book of Jubilees, with its claim of a covenant from Eden, became too dangerous to spread. And so, from church councils to mainstream translations, the book slowly disappeared. But memory does not die. Its pages still exist in ancient Ge'ez language, in the caves of Qumran, and in the hearts of those who sense something left untold. Maybe you don't need to know who hid it, if you're brave enough to open it again. But if you want to know why, then ask yourself, who stands to gain if you never read it? We were raised on Genesis, a story so familiar we nearly recite it by heart. Adam, Eve, the serpent, the forbidden fruit, and the first death. But have you ever stopped and wondered what happened after they left Eden, or before the fall? In Genesis, those details are hazy, like preludes to a tragic beginning. But in the Book of Jubilees, every gap has a name, every detail has a rhythm, and what seemed like myth becomes living history. Adam and Eve were not cast out of Eden immediately. They lived 7 years in the light, being taught, being preserved within the holy cycle. They learned how to sacrifice, how to rest on the seventh day, how to distinguish what is clean and unclean. Eden, according to Jubilees, was not just a garden, but the origin of a covenant. All commandments were not first given at Sinai, but in the light of the beginning, and that changes everything. Satan, in Genesis, is a serpent, a vague symbol, a voice from the shadows. But in Jubilees, he has a name, Mastema, not merely a tempter, but the leader of the entities that oppose divine order. He does not appear only once, but continues to operate across generations, even in Noah's time. And once you are able to name the darkness, you begin to see that the battle was never merely between man and temptation. It is a war between order and chaos, between sacred cycles and broken rhythms. Since the time of Adam, sacrifice was present. Abel did not invent the ritual. He followed a divine pattern that already existed. Noah, according to Jubilees, built an altar on the correct day in the proper way. Abraham kept the Sabbath, obeyed the purity laws, and preserved sacred traditions long before the nation of Israel came into being. Therefore, the law did not originate with Moses. The law is something remembered, and those who kept the law were the ones who still remembered the sacred rhythm of Eden. Genesis is the overture, the opening of a grand script. But Jubilees is the full orchestration. It reveals every layer of music, every beat, every lyric once sung at the beginning of time. If you read only Genesis, you know the story. But if you read Jubilees as well, you begin to see the structure. And once you see the structure, you understand that chaos came not just from sin, but from a rhythm broken. And this is the most important truth. If the law existed beforehand, if the light had a clear path, if Satan already had a name, then you are not walking through a random tale. You are living within a map already drawn. The question is, do you still remember the way? We often assume that the law began when Moses received the tablets on Mount Sinai. But what if that was never true? What if the covenant wasn't something newly created, but something remembered? The Book of Jubilees unveils a startling truth. The sacred law did not wait for Sinai. It lived quietly, faithfully, preserved by the patriarchs in a theological stream flowing all the way from Eden. Adam was not just the first man. He built an altar and offered sacrifices in the way God instructed. His son Seth continued the tradition, keeping holy days, preserving the cycle. Enoch, Adam's grandson, began recording the feasts and sacred seasons. Enoch, the patriarch taken up to heaven, was not just one who pleased God, but one who kept the calendar, preserved the writings, and lived within the rhythm of the covenant. Each generation did more than believe. They preserved a sacred system never officially written on stone, but forever etched in human history. Then came Noah, a man living in an age of chaos. But instead of merely being righteous, he lived on time. When the ark landed, his first act was not to explore the land, but to build an altar and offer sacrifice at the designated time. He taught his sons to keep the Sabbath. He distinguished between clean and unclean animals, following laws that had never been officially recorded but were always known. And because of that, he was chosen. Abraham, commonly known as the father of faith, is described in Jubilees as one who kept all commandments, laws, and ordinances. He observed the Sabbath, established household order, passed down instructions regarding marriage, offerings, and the sacred separations in food and life. He did not keep the law out of obligation, but out of remembrance. Remembrance of what had once been given in Eden, not at Sinai. Jubilees is like a quiet scroll that reorders the entire religious landscape. It does not erase what Moses received, but reveals that the covenant is not confined to time. It has always existed wherever there are people keeping the sacred rhythm. The law did not begin at Sinai. Sinai is simply where it was carved into stone. But before that, it was carved into blood, into calendars, into rituals, and into the memories of our ancestors. We often think of time as a forward-flowing stream, like an arrow that never turns back. But in Jubilees, time does not flow, it rotates. It turns in cycles, 364 days, divided into seasons, weeks, and holy festivals, like a staircase steadily connecting earth to heaven. Nothing is random. No day is meaningless. Every moment is part of a sacred song, where each heartbeat of the cosmos corresponds to a commandment given at the beginning. But then, something went wrong. Some nations began changing the calendar. They counted years by the moon, off by a few days each cycle. And from that slight difference, the error spread. Sacrifices no longer fell on the right days. Festivals were celebrated in the wrong seasons. The rituals meant to connect heaven and earth became confused. What seemed small shattered the entire sacred blueprint. Jubilees records the angel Uriel's warning. When you no longer keep the calendar correctly, the rituals will become meaningless. The covenant will no longer be remembered, and mankind will go astray. And that is exactly what happened. People continued to offer sacrifices, but on the wrong days. Continued to celebrate festivals, but at the wrong times. Continued to live religiously, but out of sync. And beneath the surface of religious activity, a sacred reality had already died. Before the Watchers fell, before the Nephilim ruled the earth, before mankind was called wicked, there was a tiny deviation, but it was enough to break the connection between human time and God's time. And when the circle was no longer closed, everything began to collapse. That is what Jubilees seeks to remind us. The sacred is not found only in morality, but in rhythm. And when time no longer turns rightly, every covenant loses its echo. So the great flood was not merely punishment for sin, it was the alarm bell signaling that time had lost its beat, and the world had to be reset from the original circle. They were not sinful beings from the start. They were chosen, entrusted to watch over humanity. The angels called the Watchers, according to Enoch and Jubilees, were sent by God to observe, assist, and uphold moral order among the descendants of Adam. They carried the light of heaven and were supposed to remain distant, like sentinels on the sacred wall. But they, the gatekeepers, opened the door for darkness to pour in. No one expected the fall to come from so high. According to Jubilees, the Watchers were seduced by the beauty of human women. But this was not merely lust. This was the first time in cosmic history that heavenly beings willingly united with flesh. They took wives, bore children. But those children were not human. They were Nephilim, large, violent, and spiritually torn between heaven and earth. It didn't stop there. The Watchers also taught humans things they were never meant to know. How to forge weapons, how to use makeup for seduction, how to cast spells, how to practice astrology, and how to blur the line between the seen and unseen. They turned divine knowledge into tools of lust and domination. They didn't just fall, they seized the role of the Creator. And from that moment, not only did man lose the covenant, but heaven itself was dragged into the chaos. The upheaval occurred not just on earth, but across the heavens. The order of Eden, where every creature had its sacred place, was shattered. And the most terrifying part, those charged with preserving order were the first to betray it. In the eyes of men, they were gods, but in God's eyes, they were sentinels who abandoned their post. And when a guard leaves his station, the enemy need not break in. The gate is already open from within. And the Nephilim are the living proof of a sacred order betrayed. We often think of sin as action, killing, violence, idolatry. But Jubilees opens a deeper level, where entire bloodlines are corrupted, not by ethics, but because the structure of the soul has been destroyed. The Nephilim are not merely large, powerful, and bloodthirsty. They are the result of a forbidden fusion between Watchers, angels, and mankind, a genetic crossing that should never have occurred. And when the bloodline is no longer pure, the covenant has no pathway to the next generation. In Jubilees, the horror is not just widespread violence, but a human lineage made impure. God made man in his image, not only in form, but in spiritual and biological order. When Watchers bore children with humans, they did not merely break morality, they shattered the very code of the divine plan. A world infected with foreign genes is a world incapable of sustaining the covenant. The principle of father to son is not just culture, it is the foundation by which the sacred covenant is preserved. Abraham teaching Isaac, Isaac passing it to Jacob. But when the Nephilim appeared, the children born no longer belonged to that sacred line. They could not receive the law, could not understand the law, could not keep the law, because their souls no longer mirrored the original divine pattern. And that is the greatest tragedy. Mankind didn't just sin. Mankind could no longer pass down what was holy. The covenant wasn't lost due to laziness, but broken because no one remained pure enough to carry it. In the view of Jubilees, the Great Flood was not simply a punishment. It was a purification, to rescue a remnant still capable of hearing, keeping, and living by the rhythm of the covenant. Not everyone who was wicked was destroyed. Only those who retained the sacred gene were preserved. Because if not, the entire human story would lose the hands needed to pass down the original light. In a chaotic world, where time had veered off the sacred rotation, where rituals were held on wrong days, where the human bloodline was mixed and souls were out of frequency, there was one man who still held the heartbeat of the covenant: Noah. He was not perfect, but he was the last who still knew the time, still knew when to sacrifice, still kept the cycles. In Jubilees, Noah is not merely righteous, he is aligned with the sacred calendar. He built altars according to ancestral patterns. He made offerings at designated times. He didn't invent a way to live. He preserved the ancient rhythm passed down from Adam, from Enoch, from the first bearers of the law. And that is what saved him and his family from the global cleansing. Not because he was morally better, but because he still heard the rhythm of the covenant, still knew when the appointed times came. The great flood was not a surprise event. In Jubilees it was foretold, scheduled, as the closing point of a broken cycle. And Noah, because he still stood in the right place, at the right time, in the sacred position, became the bridge through which the covenant continued. Noah did not keep this to himself. He recorded the law. He divided the sacred lands among his 3 sons, according to an established order. He warned them of the holy days, the rituals, the markings embedded in the sacred calendar. He fulfilled the role of a father, but with the heart of a priest, preserving the covenant's rhythm, ensuring it was not lost, even as the outside world sank away. When we think of Noah, we usually picture an ark, but the Book of Jubilees reveals he was the last clock still ticking correctly. While the rest of humanity spun in distorted cycles, Noah still lived by the days set at the beginning. And that fidelity, not vague morality, made him the bridge between the old world and the new. A living proof that where rhythm is preserved, the covenant still has a path to follow. There was an age the Bible calls before the flood. But in Jubilees, that era is not merely a time of moral crisis, but a spiritually chilling silence. Angels no longer appeared. The heavenly messengers, the watchers once sent to guard humanity, were now imprisoned or expelled. Those who once brought warnings now no longer spoke. There were no prophets, no heavenly voice. The covenant that once echoed from Eden to Abraham grew quiet, not because God stopped caring, but because no one remained on the right frequency to hear. Time went on, but no one knew what day it was on the sacred calendar. No one remembered which Sabbath was real. People still offered sacrifices, but on wrong days. They built altars, but not in the right form. They kept Passover, but at a time that no longer carried meaning. Every religious act became a performance, a ritual echo disconnected from divine intention. It was no longer individual sin, but a civilization out of rhythm. Every sacred act, instead of connecting heaven and earth, distorted the spiritual signal. Prayer offered at the wrong time was silent. Sacrifice out of season had no echo. The angels, once the timekeepers between heaven and earth, withdrew, not out of wrath, but because the rhythm had become so distorted that no signal could be transmitted. In the Book of Jubilees, this is the most terrifying sacred silence. No fire from heaven, no cloud covering the sanctuary, no voice in dreams. A civilization still breathing, but cut off from the sacred pulse. This is not merely the loss of moral direction, it is the collapse of the spiritual backbone, where humanity once knew its place in the light of God. And that is why the Great Flood was not just a punishment, it was a restoration, a reconnection of a severed line, a cleansing of distorted sacred frequencies. And it posed one final question. While the angels are silent, who among humankind is still awake enough to hear the sacred rhythm? Who still remembers what day it is according to God's calendar? And if no one remembers, how much time is left before the divine clock must be reset with water? When we think of sin, we often imagine disobedience, an act of wrongdoing, a personal choice that defies the law. But in the Book of Jubilees, the concept of sin is much deeper. Sin is not merely what you do, it's what you do out of sync with an invisible order established from the beginning of creation. A small act, a wrong day, a misaligned ritual, These can fracture the entire harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. This order runs on a sacred rhythm, a 364-day calendar, 7 Sabbaths, 14 generations, a divine clock etched into the cosmos by God Himself. And when humanity began using distorted calendars, 365 days, lunar months, they were not just mathematically incorrect, they were disconnected from God's time. That distortion didn't just affect rituals, it severed the bond between the soul and its origin. A sacrifice on the wrong day no longer opens the door of covenant. A prayer in a misaligned cycle no longer echoes in heaven. The bloodline of generations, once passed down at the appointed times, is now mixed between the sacred and the strange. And sin, in this context, is no longer a moral failure. It is the collapse of a cosmic symphony, a single off note disrupting the sacred song of the universe. This is why the Great Flood was not simply divine wrath, it was a reconfiguration. God did not destroy humanity because they were bad, but because they were out of sync. And if left unchecked, the entire planet would drift off the sacred axis. In Jubilees, we don't just see moral decay, we see a universe out of phase. And God, like a divine conductor, had to retune the strings, even if it meant silencing all sound to once again hear the original heartbeat of the covenant. The Nephilim, in modern imagination, are often seen as mighty giants, supernatural warriors, half god, half man. But in the Book of Jubilees, their existence is not merely physical, it is a profound theological warning. When the bloodline is mixed, when heaven and earth are forcibly merged outside God's will, the entire creation order spirals into chaos. The Nephilim are not frightening because of size, but because of essence. They are the clearest manifestation of a reality that has veered away from the original design. A being born of the union between fallen divine beings and fragile humanity, a hybrid that was never meant to exist. Jubilees warns, when the blood is no longer pure, sacrifices can no longer be performed properly. No one remains qualified to offer them. No community can uphold the law in fullness. The Nephilim are not just signs of moral corruption. They are indicators of a universe whose framework has been deformed. They are the final symptom, the surface crack of a system rotting from within. A world that might still function, but has lost its ability to self-heal. Like a warped instrument, no matter how well the musician plays, the sound is still off. And so, in the plan of redemption, God could not simply forgive the presence of the Nephilim. He had to rebuild the foundational structure. The Great Flood, from the perspective of Jubilees, is not an emotional outburst, but a system reboot of the sacred operating code. Once these half-human, half-divine beings infiltrated humanity's bloodstream, the covenant could no longer be sustained through existing means. The Nephilim are a warning. Some distortions cannot be fixed. They must be remade. And that is why water was poured out, not to kill, but to cleanse, not to punish, but to restore what was once right. When we think of Noah, most of us recall a righteous man in a corrupt generation, a personal moral example amidst a flood of ethical decay. But what if God's choice was not merely about morality, but about something deeper, a sacred rhythm that only one man still kept? According to the Book of Jubilees, Noah was not just good, he lived on time. He knew the 364-day cycle that God had established since the beginning. He offered sacrifices on the correct days, rested on the true Sabbaths, and passed down what the patriarchs had preserved, not through writing, but through a living practice. Noah was still tuned to the divine clock when the world had lost all frequency. In a universe breaking apart, where time was off, species were mixed, and laws were forgotten, Noah was the last remaining link between heaven and earth. He was not just a pitied survivor, but a marker preserved to reset the order. Like a clean copy of the operating system, he was placed inside a living archive, the Ark, so that after the cosmic reboot, the covenant could be restarted. God's choice of Noah was not a gesture of sentiment. It was a precise act of preservation. And because he lived in rhythm, everything around him was restored accordingly. The animals entered the ark in pairs, just as in the order of creation. The sacrifices were offered after landfall, exactly on the ancestral feast days. Even the rainbow, the sign of the renewed covenant, appeared at the exact time God gave his promise of reformation. Nothing was random. Everything was synchronized, because one man, and only one, still lived by heaven's sacred clock. Noah didn't just survive, he preserved the time of the covenant, and because of that, history was allowed to begin again. When we speak of angels in Scripture, we usually think of Michael, the warrior, Gabriel, the messenger, Raphael, the healer. But there is one angel, scarcely mentioned in the Bible, who holds a silent but crucial role in the sacred structure of the cosmos: Uriel. He carries no sword, no thunder. Uriel carries something more powerful: the calendar. In the Book of Jubilees, he is assigned to deliver to Enoch, and later Moses, the 364-day cycle, a measurement of time not belonging to man, but to God. When all rituals, holy days, and cycles of sacrifice have lost their beat, it is Uriel who appears, not to punish, but to restore the accuracy of the universe. Uriel is not the angel of messages. He is the guardian of the covenant's clock. In the chaos before the flood, when no one remembered which day was holy, which season was for offerings, or which moon was true, Uriel returned as the last perfect rhythm echoing through divine silence. He reasserted the 364-day cycle as an unbroken circle, divided into quarters, festivals, appointed times, so the covenant would not be lost. Not everyone could hear that rhythm, but those who kept the covenant, like Noah, did, and because of that, history was preserved. Strangely, God did not send fire to burn away the first distortions. He did not use swords to cut off the mixed bloodline instantly. He sent Uriel, the one who resets the clock. That reveals something profound. Living on time is not a habit, but a reflection of the divine. A person may be weak, may fail, but if they live in the rhythm of the covenant, they still hold a thread to heaven. Uriel is not a vague symbol. He is a reminder. Time is sacred, and to live on time is a holy act, a silent resistance against global chaos. In Uriel's return was the final opportunity for the world to realign. And each of us, if we can still hear sacred time, might still be holding a part of the covenant long forgotten by generations. When we hear the great flood, our minds default to wrath, a punishment on all humanity for sin. But the Book of Jubilees unveils another perspective, even a contradictory one. The flood was a sacred ritual, a redemptive act of recreation, not to destroy out of hatred, but to preserve what was on the brink of extinction, the covenant. When time was distorted, the bloodline mixed, the sacred law forgotten, and rituals performed out of sync, the entire structure of the universe ceased to reflect divine will. In such a world, every sacred action became meaningless and every offering ineffective. And so water came, not like a sword striking down, but like a cleansing stream washing the dust off a blurred covenant tablet. The Great Flood was not a passing anger, it was a cosmic purification ritual, a holy washing for an ecosystem infected by distortion. In Jubilees, Noah did not merely survive, he passed through a rite, a washing, not just of body, but of time. When he stepped onto dry land, he did not return to a restored old world, but entered a new era, where the covenant was renewed with a rainbow and time began again, on rhythm. Only those who lived on time, like Noah, were brought across the waters. Not because they were perfect, but because they still kept heaven's clock calling for synchronization. The Great Flood became a doorway, not out of life, but into a new life, in alignment with the original design. Through the lens of Jubilees, the flood is no longer a tragedy, but a sacred festival of beginnings, a ritual so profound that only those still on time could perceive its holy essence. And that is why water did not only kill, it rescued the covenant. Calendars, today, are seen as tools for scheduling work, setting appointments, or counting down to holidays. But in the Book of Jubilees, the calendar is not a lifeless grid of numbers. It is the deepest divine structure of the covenant. The 364-day cycle, established by God from the beginning, not only measures time, but aligns mankind with heaven. Each day, each week, each month is not administrative, but sacred rhythm, where all rituals, sacrifices, and religious acts occur on time, without missing a beat. But humanity lost it. When mankind shifted to distorted calendars, mixing lunar and solar systems, what seemed convenient became distortion. Sacrifices fell on wrong days. Sabbaths were misaligned. Sacred time markers became blurry. Worse still, people continued these religious acts, but off time, as if performing a sacred symphony out of rhythm. In Jubilees, abandoning the 364-day calendar was not a technical error. It was a foundational rupture of the covenant. Because the covenant is not just about promises, it's about a system functioning on appointed timing. The Great Flood, from this viewpoint, is a dire warning, not just the consequence of moral failure, but the collapse of the time cycle itself. And after the flood, Noah's first act was not to build a house, but to build an altar on the appointed day, to restore the calendar, to re-establish the covenant with the original rhythm. This shows us living in sacred time is not a burdensome ritual, but a condition for life to continue in the right direction. Sadly, the 364-day calendar, today, has nearly been erased from the memory of the world. We are living within a time system created by man, yet we call it standard. We worship, celebrate, and offer on man's calendar, yet hope for divine resonance. Could it be that we are playing a song out of rhythm and do not even realize it? The sacred calendar, according to Jubilees, is not an outdated relic. It is the cosmic clock. And if we do not adjust our time, then perhaps we are losing an entire covenant without even knowing it. When the flood had passed, when the cries had fallen silent, and when the ground still glistened with the cold tears of humanity, Noah, the last man still in rhythm, stepped out of the ark. He did not build a house. He did not found a city. He did not search for food. The very first thing Noah did was build an altar. This was not an emotional impulse, nor a fleeting expression of gratitude. According to the Book of Jubilees, this was a ritual already present in the tradition of the patriarchs, preserved from the time of Adam, Abel, and Enoch. Noah, as the keeper of memory, restored the ritual on the correct day, selected the appropriate clean animals, and offered the sacrifice in exact sequence. Not a beat off, not a moment late, because he knew if the covenant was not restored, survival would be meaningless. In that moment, the covenant was re-established. Not through a voice from the heavens, not by a contract etched in stone, but through worship performed on time with the right offering by the sacred law in a world just cleansed. Life was not merely reconnected biologically, but reset spiritually. Noah's altar was not the first in history, but it was the first after an era of dissonance, after a time when the covenant had been forgotten, thrown off course, disrupted by foreign metaphysical forces. And at that altar, a fragrance rose, as Scripture describes, that moved God. This was not a bribe, it was the act that reopened dialogue. Noah was not merely a survivor. He was the one who reconnected heaven and earth. In Jubilees, he is described as a priest, not by ordination, but because his faithful life was itself a sacred credential. His actions caused the angels to record a new cycle, as though the universe itself had been recalibrated through one man's faithfulness. From that moment forward, human history was written not just by what people did, but by whether they lived in sync with the sacred rhythm. Noah's altar, at its core, was humanity's first answer to a covenant rescued from the waters, an answer not given in words, but in timing. As the waters receded and the sky turned blue again, Noah's family were not merely survivors. They were what remained of a sacred structure that had once fractured. In the world's eyes, they were a father, a mother, 3 sons, and 3 daughters-in-law. But through the lens of Jubilees, they were a sacred archive of the entire memory of the covenant. The law, the calendar, the lineage, and the sacred order from Eden. Each person in that family carried not just human DNA, but a divine genetic legacy. They were the fragile bridge between a world cleansed and one about to begin again. Noah, the rhythm keeper, passed it on to his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But the Book of Jubilees makes it clear, not all 3 retained the spirit of the covenant. Though all were saved, only the line of Shem remained pure-blooded, chosen by God to continue the lineage that keeps the law. Shem was the one who preserved correct memory, the one who extended the sacred pulse, and would become the forefather of Abraham. While Ham, though the father of many nations, soon fell out of rhythm, and Japheth, despite his numerous descendants, was not placed at the center of the covenant. This reveals a critical truth. Survival does not equal being chosen. Being rescued does not mean being entrusted with the sacred fire. What God requires is not merely those who escape judgment, but those who can continue living rightly. And that begins with preserving the lineage, not just biologically, but spiritually, memory, law, and sacred timing. Noah's family, especially Shem, became the foundation of a new age. In that time, there were no cities, no human legal systems, no religious institutions. Only one thing defined who belonged to God: rhythm. Whoever lived by the 364-day cycle, whoever sacrificed on the correct day, whoever distinguished clean from unclean, whoever preserved the lineage and avoided mixture, these were the ones who kept the sacred breath alive. Noah's family didn't just restart humanity. They symbolized that true life flows not just from blood, but from faithfulness. And within them, the covenant was sown again, quietly, like a seed awaiting its season to bloom. When the great flood ended, many thought it marked the end of an age and the birth of something entirely new. But if we read Jubilees carefully, we realize the covenant was never broken. It merely shifted rhythm from one cycle to another, like one season flowing into the next. God did not create an entirely new program. He simply ensured that the original frequency continued to resonate, even if only through one man, one family, or one rare generation who still held the rhythm. Noah was not just a survivor, he was a memory keeper. In Jubilees, he didn't only offer sacrifice after the flood, he documented, replicated the patriarchal laws, reinstated the sacred festivals, and passed the 364-day calendar on to his sons. He didn't build a temple, he re-established sacred rhythm. For Noah, the covenant was not a wall-mounted manuscript. It was a cycle of life, resting on the right day, offering at the right time, distinguishing between holy and profane. And he understood, if this was not preserved, the covenant would not disappear, but would lose its beat, and humanity would live without hearing God's voice. Jubilees does not tell history linearly, but cyclically. 49 years, a jubilee. 7 weeks of years, a sacred era. Each person who lives by the cycle is someone who repeats the covenant, not through speeches or loud ceremonies, but by a quiet life in step with the law. Holiness does not lie in formality, but in repeated acts done at the right time. Like an ancient song, if even one person remembers the melody, the whole symphony can one day rise again. And so, the covenant did not close atop Mount Ararat. It flowed through the bloodline of Shem. It lived in the recorded scrolls. It hid in the memory of those who kept the Sabbath, even in a world that had lost track of time. And it resounded, quietly but steadfastly, in the souls who still ask today, what day is it on God's calendar? If you have ever felt like you're living out of sync, if you've ever sensed something off in the rhythm of modern life, then perhaps the echo of the covenant is still reaching you. You don't need an ark. You don't need a mountain. You just need one decision to keep what is sacred as an eternal cycle that never stops. And when you begin to walk in that sacred rhythm, the covenant doesn't just revive, it flows through you, just as it once flowed through Noah. None of us is perfect. And the most wondrous truth in Jubilees is this: God never demanded perfection. He asked only one thing: do you remember? Remember the sacred rhythm of life, where time is not just for scheduling, but for connecting to the covenant. You don't need to instantly become a perfect lawkeeper. No one can. But you can begin with what seems like a simple question. What day is it according to God? Not your watch, not the Roman calendar, not your phone app, but the cycle that was established in Eden. If you feel your life is offbeat, do not be afraid. It is not a sign of condemnation. It is a signal to return. Like an instrument that has gone out of tune over time, no one throws it away for a few wrong notes. The craftsman adjusts it, patiently, lovingly, until it sings again. God is the same. He does not scold you for losing your way. He waits for you to return to the cycle. And that cycle is not invisible. It is in the Book of Jubilees, in the 364-day calendar, in the Sabbaths, in the sacred seasons, in the quiet lives of those who seem alone, but are actually walking in rhythm with heaven. If you've ever felt like you're drifting, praying without echo, doing good but feeling empty, perhaps the issue is not your faith, but your rhythm. Perhaps you're using the wrong clock to measure sacred time, and the Book of Jubilees arrives not to condemn, but to offer a map, a way back, a way that, even in your imperfection, you might become a keeper of the covenant, simply because you still remember. Remember that there was once another rhythm, a sacred cycle, waiting for someone to walk back into it. Not perfectly, just faithfully. Maybe you've never preached a sermon, never stood on a stage, never written a book, never led a church. Maybe you live quietly, holding the Sabbath in your heart, eating in a way that honors what is clean and unclean, feeling a strange unease when the world celebrates out of sync. Maybe you've thought, I'm just an ordinary person. Does what I hold on to even matter? But the Book of Jubilees gives you a surprising answer. Yes. The covenant has never been sustained by the crowd. It has been kept alive by those who seem nameless. Those who never let go of the sacred rhythm, even when no one else noticed. There wasn't always an Enoch. There wasn't always a Moses. But there were always a few who lived on beat, and they are the reason the covenant has never truly died. Jubilees says that God records every cycle kept, every ritual performed at its appointed time, and He remembers each person. You are not forgotten, you are not invisible, you are living proof that God's plan has not failed. That there is still a faithful current flowing beneath history, through the chaos, through the cultural confusion. And if today you are still living this way, quietly, faithfully, holding on, then you are extending an ancient covenant. You are the remaining light, small perhaps, but enough to keep the covenant map from vanishing. Don't wait for applause. Don't wait for the crowd to return. If you keep the rhythm, the covenant still lives, because true light does not need a crowd. It only needs one soul who still believes the dawn is worth waiting for. You don't need to be a prophet. You don't need to change the world. Maybe all it takes is one small act done on time to shake the sacred space around you. Tomorrow, try resting on the true Sabbath, not out of law, but out of love for the original breath. Or simply open a calendar and mark off 49 days as a silent reminder that you still remember how God measures time. Or even whisper to yourself, today is the day light was created. You are restoring a forgotten clock, not worn on your wrist, but carried in your soul. And perhaps your quiet action is the very beginning of a new cycle, a current that will reconnect the sacred lifeline, not only for you, but for your family, for a community out of sync, for an age that has forgotten how to hear the covenant's call. Begin with one small step, but take it on time. You are not just returning. You are reopening history. If you've stayed with this story until this final moment, then this is no longer a video. It is a quiet calling in your heart. Don't let it pass like just another piece of content. Leave a comment, not just to say thank you, but to record a piece of memory, a sacred rhythm that just awakened in you. Maybe it was a detail that made you pause, a question that stirred your soul, or a feeling that reminded you you are not alone in this journey to find the covenant again. You don't need to preach. Just tell a story, a time when you lived rightly, but no one noticed. A time when you kept a small commandment the world saw as unnecessary. Or maybe the opposite, a time when you were out of sync, lost the sacred time, and now you long to find it again. These quiet testimonies are how we reconnect the severed thread, how we revive the memory the world has forgotten. Write it down so the memory doesn't vanish again. Share it so others know they are not alone. And maybe from your one small word, a new cycle will start again, not with debate, but with the echo of one soul to another. Amen.